This is the Morning Tempo Podcast. I am your host, Rabanzo. On this podcast, I have conversations with business owners and the entrepreneurial with the slant toward creativity. It's an opportunity for you to learn with me from people who are finding success in the business world, all intended to make your entrepreneurial journey a little bit easier. Welcome to another Morning Tempo episode, my podcast enthusiast, entrepreneurial, creative friends. It is a pleasure to be coming to you through your earbuds or car speakers or however you listen to your podcasts. If you've been following my expat journey, by the way, the wife and I and our trusty pets have settled into our new home in Querétaro, but it wasn't without a little bit of uphill challenge. The challenge of moving to a new country, forgot what that was like. And two illnesses that afflicted me, one of which was COVID, which really was not fun. The trusty mascotas or pets also had to see the vet. I didn't see the vet. I did actually talk to the vet about some of my problems, but I went to a doctor. But they had to see the vet. But they're all good now, and I think the bad luck has already passed its peak, and things are looking bright. We're actually loving it here. My guest for this episode is also an expat of the digital nomad variety. Her name is Jennifer Briney. She's host of Congressional Dish, a podcast that aims to draw attention to where American people truly have power, Congress. And it's from the perspective of a fed-up taxpayer with no allegiance to any political party. That's Jennifer Briney. She fills us in on the must-know information about what our representatives do after the election and how their actions can and do affect our day-to-day lives. That is straight from her website, I believe. I captured it a while back, but I think it sums it up. Jen and I met at Podcast Movement 2021 in Nashville. Boy, time has passed as I'm recording this finally. I'm really honored to feature her in today's episode. I believe she's doing important work, and in as nonpartisan a fashion as nonpartisan can be. Congressional Dish is an eye-opener for those who get news from any of the primary outlets or the popular ones such as cable TV, Apple News Feed, or legacy print publications. Yes, I love to use the word legacy in front of print publications. Jen and I don't focus exclusively on the content of Congressional Dish, although we do talk about it. I did also get to know a little bit about her, which is what I really enjoy doing on this podcast. But I do encourage you to check out an episode or two of Congressional Dish. You can find it wherever fine podcasts are served. And I'll also put a link in the show notes for you. Yes, we do talk about her podcast and her history with Podcast Movement. The business model behind Congressional Dish, yes, it's a business for Jennifer. Her now infamous AMA on Reddit. It's worth reading about. I'll put a link to a relevant article in the show notes. We also discuss her digital nomad travel lifestyle, which Congressional Dish helps to fund, and the big lessons she has learned in her podcast journey, in particular that value is the key to success. That makes sense, right? If you do something that has value, Jen says that is a product. And we talk about building trust one person at a time as it relates to that value. You can find Jen at congressionaldish.com or at Jen Briney on Twitter and Instagram. All right, please enjoy my conversation with Jennifer Briney. Thank you for coming on, Jen. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nice to speak to you again.
Yeah. You were in Honolulu somewhat recently, is that right?
I was. Yeah, I went with my mom for a few days before Christmas and my husband. And we just went to, I used to live in Waikiki. So we went back to Waikiki to just do nothing since I've done absolutely everything there is to do on that island. So I actually got my my booster and laid in bed for a day. Yeah.
Wow. We got ours during travel too. I wasn't in such an exotic place. I was in Arlington, Texas, but it was still nice to get it.
Yeah. Wherever you can get it, go for it, right?
Yeah. And I know you grew up in Southern California. Was it Long Beach that you grew up in that area?
Irvine, not too far, a little bit south of there. Mm-hmm.
So what was that like when you were a kid?
It was very different from what it is now. It was actually surprisingly rural. So I lived in a planned community. And so my entire world was in this 3.5 mile circle. And right outside of that, it was just miles and miles of orange trees. Like, it seemed to me like the end of the earth was about a block away. And since then, they've mowed down all those orange trees and it's become a major city. But when I lived there, it was kind of like the 1950s Leave It to Beaver type of childhood. Like, all the parents in the neighborhood watched all of the kids. Like, when they say it takes a village, like, we had a village. It's interesting because my parents weren't able to track me. I was born in the 1980s. And so I was just one of those kids where it was like, okay, be home by dark. And it was safe. And we had our own little world out there. And my childhood was amazing, honestly. I have no complaints.
I'm smiling. It sounds really nice. My wife and I moved to San Jose, California in 1999, and we saw the very last of the orchards, but every time we met someone who was a true local, who was born and raised there, and some of them are our closest friends, it was always fun to talk to them about all the changes, which sound very similar to what you just described, with the orange groves and then, the big city that came afterwards, and what happened to San Jose too.
Yeah, it's very, very similar. A lot of places in California have experienced that, but it's funny because when I tell people I'm from Irvine, it's just such a different place now. So it's got a different connotation now than it did way back then.
Sure. I sort of know it or think of it in terms of sort of lined with corporate offices. And never, I might have been there once, but, when I was working in Silicon Valley, Irvine was always sort of mentioned in that connotation, so-and-so's offices are there. But so the other thing we talked about very briefly before hanging up and getting back on to see if we could sort out the sound was that you and I met ever so briefly. You were doing opening ceremonies at Podcast Movement 2021 in Nashville. Had you done that before? And how did it come about, either that one or had you done them before?
I've actually done every orientation that they've had at Podcast Movement. And
amazing. Since when? When did they start?
I want to say it was maybe 2016 or 2017. And the reason that I was picked is that Podcast Movement, do you know how it was, like the origins of Podcast Movement?
Not as much as I should. Of course, that was my first one to ever go to. And if I remember right, the first one was in Fort Worth, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. And I mentioned that because I was born in Fort Worth, Texas.
I want to say the first one was actually in Dallas because I remember Fort Worth. I think that was the second. But those are very similar cities right next door to each other. So, yeah, it was definitely born out of Texas because that's where Dan Franks was living. I think maybe Jared was living there too. But basically, when they started Podcast Movement, it was born out of a conference that we were all going to that disappeared. There was a conference called New Media Expo, and they had given us a podcasting track, finally. And so a lot of us were meeting up every year at New Media Expo, and then some stuff happened. It's a story for another day, but New Media Expo disappeared. And so in the absence of that, those of us that had been going to New Media Expo, they, Dan Franks, Jared Easley, I think there were a couple other people involved too, but they started a Kickstarter because we wanted to have a conference, and they said, how about we do just podcasting? And if we can get this many people to support it on Kickstarter, we'll do it. And so they did the Kickstarter. I remember the first one, it was pretty small, and it was in a hotel that was attached to a mall. It was not at all like the conference that you went to. But because I was in the Kickstarter year and knew the history, years later when the conference had, I think we're up to 1,000 people by the time we started doing orientation. We had so many new people that they wanted to have new attendee orientations in order to tell people, this is what Podcast Movement is, and here's some strategies for making the most of it. And so they asked Joe Salsehi to run the orientation, and then me and Rich Jones were kind of his backup dancers. And so The guys have kind of filtered in and out. So Rich, he was on the stage with me this year. You saw Rich, but for a couple of years he didn't do it. And so, but I'm the one, I love it. I love being the camp counselor that gets to say hi to all the new people. And I get a real kick out of it. So now it's my rodeo. Like I'm the one that puts it all together. And I'm just kind of like, we're at the point now where it's just kind of assumed that I'm going to do it because I love it so much. And yeah, so that's how I ended up on that stage. It really just came out of me being one of the first people to be involved in making the conference happen. And then just being, honestly, I think it's because I was friends with Dan and Jared and they were just like, who's going to represent us well? And yeah, I'm honored that they picked me. And I'm honored that they let me keep doing it. I mean, to be the face for all of the new people to meet first in the conference, like I really do take it as an honor and a privilege.
Yeah, well, what a nice standing gig. And it was nice for me. I was a newbie, although I'd been following the conference for a while. And like I said, there was an early one in Fort Worth that you were part of, clearly, that I wanted to go to and just didn't. We weren't living there at the time. But it was nice. It was really nice to go to that for you guys to. It was also a weird year, right? I'm talking less and less about the pandemic, I think, but it was a weird year because we're in the pandemic. And so it was nice. It was like, you know, now that I think about it, we're talking about it, it was almost like going from primary to middle school or middle school to high school, because it was so weird last year, I think. And I've been living in Panama, and they were pretty strict about lots of things like still are with masks. And I'm going to Nashville, and I have family there, but I'm like, okay, what's it going to be like there? I was a little worked up about it, but it was a pleasant experience. And from what I heard, I guess I heard your sort of debrief through Congressional Dish. It must have been, but it sounds like you had a nice time too.
Oh yeah, I had a blast. It was nice to see, like I learn a lot just from being there. So even though my show is established and I'm kind of, humming along, just from meeting people and seeing how they're doing things differently and hearing about their shows, like I always bring something back with me. I always learn something, whether I'm trying to or not. So I love going. And then it's also, for me, there's a very small group of people in my life that understand what it's like to have a job where I'm speaking essentially to strangers. So to be able to talk to other people who also get the crazy emails and the feedback that doesn't seem to match what you feel like you're doing, like it does feel like therapy to me almost to go to these conferences and to be around other people that can relate. Because no one in my social life, like my best friends are not podcasters or famous people. So it's like, it's one of the places where I feel like I can go and people understand my unique job issues. And I never miss podcast movement.
You know, speaking of that, the unique issues that you bring up, I was listening to a podcast interview you did for, is it Challenging Opinions, something like that, with William Campbell from maybe 2019. And I was also watching the C-SPAN, Washington Journal's C-SPAN interview that you did today. And
oh, nice.
As someone, I'm trying to learn a little bit about, and what you've been doing, but
I appreciate that. You did your homework. I think that's cool.
I try. Listening to people, some of the callers or the questions that you got from the podcaster, I always think, God, these feel, for a lot of us, this is like a loaded question, and you very calmly, and probably don't feel that way because you discuss these in a very serious manner. And many of the people, I assume, come to you fairly educated, but I could not help think what I think you were just saying is that not always do people come to you from a place of really knowing what they're talking about, and sometimes they might come to you with hostility that, obviously is not welcome. And is that what I understood you just said, more or less?
Yeah. And I think because my topic for Congressional Dish it's inherently political, because I do make a distinction where I feel like my show is about government, not politics. Like, I'm not really interested in the he said, she said. I'm not interested at all in campaigns and, the money race, the stuff that like the corporate media is focusing on. That's not what I do. I read the bills and the laws and I watch the hearings and I'm looking at, how are you representing me in the world and what are you doing with my money and how is it going to affect my life? So I feel like I'm focusing on the governing part of it. But people that don't listen to my show don't know that. And so I think we have a lot of people in the United States that think that being informed means picking a political team. Usually you're, waving a red flag or a blue flag. And if someone perceives that I'm not on their team, it's combative right away. And that's hard for me, because it's like, I'm not getting into this to debate. I'm not trying to be a pundit. I'm trying to learn what's going on in government. And so to have to deal with hostility from people that I not only don't know, but people who have very strong opinions about something I say or do and have very clearly not done their homework on me, it's really hard for me to not take it personally. And I'm getting better at it. This is my 10th year of Congressional Dish. So I'm learning over time, what that is and how not to be offended by it. But sometimes it's hard, I don't react that way to people. I don't speak that way to people. So for people to speak horribly to me, even though I know I have the block button, it still gets through to me. So I'm learning how to put up walls and how to, establish boundaries with my audience. And it's hard too, because I also really love my audience. There's people that I want to meet in person and I don't want to have these boundaries, but because I don't know who is on the other end of my microphone, I kind of have to have boundaries with everyone. So it's just figuring out how to deal with people I don't know having strong opinions about my work. When I was waiting tables, no one cared what I did. I wasn't getting random emails from someone having very strong opinions. So that's a part of the job that I knew would happen, but I wasn't prepared for it. And I don't know if you ever can be prepared for it. So that's what I was alluding to when I say, you go and you talk to other podcasters, maybe a lot of my friends don't deal with it to the extent that I do, but all of us deal with it. All of us have gotten that 1-star review that keeps us awake at night. So to one extent to another, all podcasters can at least relate on some level. And it's nice to know that I have people to talk to.
Well, and if you can't relate to it, you haven't made it yet. You need some haters.
It's true. It's true.
Well, obviously people are really paying attention, which brings me to something I wanted to ask about. Maybe it doesn't go much of anywhere, but you did I don't even remember the year, but you did an AMA on Reddit, which apparently was, at least in the eyes of someone who wrote about it, a big deal for you, and it was a kind of a case study and a great execution and preparation and everything. What did that AMA mean to you and Congressional Dish?
That whole experience was wild because I don't really participate on Reddit. So there were these two guys that were writing a book about Reddit, and they said, we would love for you to do an AMA. We'll set it up for you, but we want to use you as a case study and just see what kind of reaction do you get. So I said sure, and I said I'll block off, a day for it because I didn't know how long it would take. And I turned off my phone, and I always do that. So when I'm talking to you right now, I don't have any notifications coming in. I give my full attention to whatever I'm doing with the public. So I turn off my phone, and the way that they had approached it on Reddit is they said that I read over 250 bills, which was accurate at the time. This was in the beginning of my show. And it was she's read all these bills, ask me anything. And 8 hours later, I was still answering questions. And I didn't realize that that's not normal. I didn't realize that usually you do an AMA as a non-celebrity and you're done after 20 minutes. And so after 8 hours, I got kind of tired and I turned on my phone and it was just bing, 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 bing. So many notifications came in, and I didn't realize that my AMA not only went to the top of the AMA page, it went to the top spot on Reddit. And I didn't understand the significance of that. So before that, my show was maybe getting 100, 150 downloads per episode. And that day it got 30,000, which was insane. Now, unfortunately, back then my show was garbage, so a lot of those people didn't stick around. but it was amazing how that happened. And then we tried it again because it worked out so well. We tried it again during the Trump years, And I did not get the same traction. I was done in like 45 minutes. So I think a lot of that had to do with it being the Obama years and people were trying to inform themselves. Things didn't feel so intense politically. And I think by the time we did it in the middle of the Trump years, people just didn't want to, they weren't seeking out politics because you couldn't get away from it. So I think that definitely hurt that strategy for marketing the second time we tried it. But yeah, that day, I think now looking back on it, because I think that was 2015, so it's been 7 years. I think looking back on that day now, what that gave me more than anything was the confidence to know that people did care about my subject matter and were hungry for the information that I was also looking for. And so the show has gotten better. I wish I could get that kind of traction now that I think that the show is pretty high quality. But for me, just the confidence it gave me that I was doing the right thing and I should keep going, I think that was a really key moment for me and the show.
It must have been amazing. I was reading the article just thinking to myself, can you imagine, how that felt? And I haven't gone back to listen to any of what you call your garbage episodes or the early ones. I've listened to maybe a few of the more. Well, no, some of them you've referenced as source material. So I'm like, oh, maybe I should listen to that.
It's true. I have.
The stuff that I've listened to is obviously really good. And and I'm sure that whatever your download aspirations are, they will come. It's a great show. I want to steer in a different direction for a moment. Something I try to do on this podcast is explore where creativity meets small business. And I see you as someone who is doing sort of living creatively through existence as a digital nomad. And I heard something funny today. Well, I thought it was kind of funny. It's not funny really, but in your means of gaining access to health insurance by getting married, that's kind of creative too. But can you talk about...
I do love my husband, but we got married before we wanted to, for sure, for those reasons.
Sure you did. I'm just kidding. No, I know you like the guy. At the very least, you like him a lot because I hear you talk about him, but on the podcast. But how do you see how do you see yourself or maybe some of your peers, if you have to look from the outside, that have a similar lifestyle? Maybe they're podcasting, maybe they're not, but how do you see that in terms of... What I'm trying to get at is like in this, what seems to me is, and maybe it all just seems so, hey, there was nothing creative about it, just things that had to happen. But I think for a lot of people that, on this podcast, I do have interviewed, and I'm sure I will continue to interview people that are in the online business world. I love interviewing people that are in the, in the real life business world or the brick and mortar business world as to these small businesses. And as a podcaster, podcasting is sort of in between, but I suppose you're as much of an online business person as anything, but you have this digital nomad thing that gets thrown in there. Do you see that, or people that live this way, do you see that as a creative aspect of making your business happen at all, or just like, nah, that's just kind of how I had to do it?
Well, it's not really a had to thing. So the podcast was a way for me to pursue the life of travel that I couldn't afford to do. It's not that I couldn't afford it. I mean, yes, I couldn't afford it. I didn't have money. But if I was doing a job that involved me having to go to an office or a restaurant or just like having to be in one location, I couldn't see the world. So for me, when I looked at the idea of doing a podcast, and like, keep in mind, this was back in 2012. And I feel like until Serial in 2014, I was still getting what's a podcast as my number one question from people when I told them what I did.
How do I get it?
Yeah. So it was like, how do I make a business out of this? Like that was not really thought through. In fact, I remember when I told my dad about the idea, he goes, listen, you keep talking about doing this idea. I don't really understand what a podcast is. I have no idea how you're going to make money, but he's like, I think you'll regret it if you don't try, and I'll help you in any way I can. But he was just like, the money part, I don't see it. And I didn't really see it either. But I was just like, I think if I make something valuable, they will pay for it. They will come. Field of Dreams was my favorite movie as a kid. So I kind of built the baseball stadium. And so, Yeah, so I just took this leap of faith. And what was really great for me when it came to turning this creative venture into a business is I gave myself the first year to go all in on the creativity and didn't worry about money. So my husband and I, we've taken turns when it comes to like prioritizing each other's businesses. So like when he was getting his graduate's degree, I was doing all kinds of odd jobs to pay the bills. And when he got his degree in solar engineering, I was waiting tables in Hawaii. And so it was kind of my turn. And instead of going $100,000 into debt to go into, getting a master's degree and I don't even know what, we decided that for 1 year, I would try this idea, see if there's an audience, see if I enjoy doing the podcast. Do I enjoy reading the bills and laws every day for a living? Do I enjoy making a script out of it? Do I enjoy all of it, right? And after that first year, I decided like, yes, this is something like the day-to-day work is something that I find fulfilling. I feel like I'm making a positive dent in the world, even if I'm only talking to 100 people. And then it was like, okay, now how do we monetize it? So when it comes to like that balance of creativity and business, for me, I looked at what do I want to do in my life? And I said, well, I need a job or career that is location independent in order to live how I'm living now. And then, the money, I just figured like if you're making something valuable, there has to be a way to monetize that. It wasn't necessarily an afterthought. I knew that it would have to happen, but I had to make sure that if I was going to dedicate my life to this, if I was going to like really work on making this product, I had to make sure it fit with my life first. And I'm really glad I did it in that order. And so now that I'm a digital nomad, like this was the goal. The podcast wasn't the goal. The business wasn't the goal. It was my lifestyle that was the goal. And now I have it. And so, I mean, if the podcast gets big or if it stays the size it is, like I'm already successful in what I set out to do. And if it makes a difference in the world, great. But my selfish cause, I'm already there. So I hope that answers your question.
I love that. It does. And as I finished asking it and you were answering it, I thought, well, this is, in some regards, it's generational for you. There are a lot of people today striving, desiring to do the same. Maybe not a lot of them actually doing it, but it's something that a lifestyle that a lot of people think about and arguably several reach for. A follow-up question. I have read that Adam Curry, and forgive me if I'm butchering his name, John C. Dvorak, were kind of a model for what you do with Congressional Dish to create the income and the lifestyle. Can you speak to that and if that's true, what specific parts of it meant the most to you being able to form your own model and personalize it for Congressional Dish?
John and Adam have been really helpful to me. But what's funny about my relationship with them is that I didn't know that they were celebrities, which I know is a little ridiculous because like Adam Curry invented my industry, but I had no idea who they were. But back when New Media Expo was, the conference, they were doing podcast awards and my show was nominated in news and politics. And so I was checking out the competition and I heard these no agenda guys and they said something, as they always do, that I didn't agree with. And so I went on Twitter, looked him up, and we just started a conversation. And I didn't look at how many followers they had. I didn't care. I was just talking to the other guys that I felt were my equals because we were nominees in the same category. So I think that's why I wasn't intimidated to introduce myself, because I, from the very beginning, was like, hey, random podcasters, let's talk about this thing you talked about on your show. So we kind of became friends online. Then we met in person. I met Adam in person at one of these award things. And then I don't even know really how it happened, but we just started trading emails. And then John C. Dvorak, he lives in the Bay Area and I was living there too. And so John took me out to lunch quite a few times actually, and just kind of encouraged me to not go the advertising route, they explained to me how their business model works, and they were doing it for years before I was, so they've given me the lessons that they learned. And anytime I have a question, I know that I can always reach out to either one of them. I do consider them both friends. So, and it was a really great time for me to meet them, because it was at that point where it's like, okay, I have to make a business out of this. And I knew I didn't like advertisements, and I didn't want them in my show. And so I just think when they offered me a path forward where I wouldn't have to take advertisers and, kiss corporate ass and risk, pissing off a sponsor and then losing all of my income. Like, I really am afraid of that because of the way that I cover governing. Like, I don't have any allegiance to any political party, and like, that's not lucrative in the corporate space. So, the fact that there were people that came before me, and in podcasting, we're kind of inventing this industry as we go. I still feel like the industry is in its infancy. So to have people that went before me and that were willing to kind of, show me their way, I'll always be grateful to them. And just giving me the courage to have faith in my audience and have faith in the value of what I'm doing, and just all of the kind words that they've given to me. And they've talked about my show on their show, which I really appreciate. Like, they were what they were and still are. Very kind, very helpful people. And yeah, I would say that I do owe some of my success to the knowledge that they built before I started my show.
That's a great story. And I have forgotten the name of their show. Can you say it for
No
my
Agenda.
listeners?
No Agenda.
No Agenda. That's right. Yeah. I've listened to it a couple times. It's pretty cool. I was really fascinated by the model they were using. Okay. I had kind of committed to you 30 minutes of time. We've already gone a little over. Do you need to run? If you have time, I got a couple questions, but I'm totally able and willing to let you go now.
I can do about 15 more minutes. I have a hard out of 8 p.m. because my husband needs the hotel room. I sent him down to the lobby, so when he starts his calls, I need to give him the room back.
Let's keep it to just one question then, and then it'll be all on you. So I guess I really want to know what have been the biggest lessons for you in the Congressional Dish / podcaster journey. Biggest things you've learned.
Wow. There's so many different ways to go with this answer. I mean, I think that the most important thing that I think I've learned is that value is just key, right? Like, if you do something that has value, then that is a product. And that if it's done well, I think that it can be monetized. And so, I look back on that first year when I was doing this with the worst $30 podcasting setup you could possibly imagine. My microphone stand didn't even stand up. It would like fall in the middle of the recordings. It was terrible. And I was editing my own show on GarageBand, and and I had to build my credibility and had to earn audience trust and their shares person by person, because, there's a lot of people that get into podcasting as celebrities and they're like, podcasting's so easy to succeed. And it's like, yeah, but you're a celebrity. Like, I'm not a celebrity, and I'm doing a topic that's not sexy most of the time. And so the fact that I've been able to build this audience as a non-celebrity, I attribute it 100% to the value of the information and of the show. And I think it's also really important now, more so than when I began, but we live in this information age where people don't know who they can trust. And so I think building the trust has been very, very key to my success too. Like, I provide all of the sources that I use for every episode, and we're talking like dozens of documents. And for hearings, I give people the timestamps so that they can go and listen to the testimony I'm sharing with them in context. And I just feel like asking your audience to trust you without building that trust, I think that's a problem. Like, everyone's willing to give their opinions on stuff, but if you're going to give information, if you're going to inform, I think you have to actually take the time to give that information. And so just seeing how important the show notes have been, not even necessarily because a lot of people use them. I don't think a lot of people do, but just the fact that they know that they're there. And the one time that they decided to call my bluff on something and they go to the show notes and they find the thing they're looking for, that credibility is gold, right? And it's valuable, right? Like you just know that the person that you're hearing from, whether you agree with the opinion or not, you at least know that it's based on this article, this document, like this piece of testimony. Like, I just think that it's really important right now to tell people what your knowledge base is. And I'm carrying that forward. I have another podcast that I do with Jonathan Oakes. We call it Talking Fat because he's trying to lose weight and I've been on Weight Watchers for now 14 years. And so we're doing this together. And if we talk about the food pyramid or whatever, like we will provide a link in our Facebook group. And that's why we try not to be like, oh, I know this information, because then we both feel like it's necessary to look it up and share it. And it's important to take responsibility for the information you're putting out. And if it's valuable, yeah, there's a future there if you're creating value out of nothing.
That's great. I didn't know about the other podcast. Thanks for sharing that. And I want to share something, so let me know if I have these two things right or if they're the best. But it looks to me the best places to find out about you and what you're doing are congressionaldish.com and at Jen Briney on Twitter. Is that right?
That is where I have my biggest following. Yes. If you want to get political, follow me on Twitter. If you want to see lots of pictures of my dog and like the digital nomad type stuff, I'm also at Jen Briney on Instagram. So that's more like the personal stuff. And then Twitter is where I go to rant and rave.
where people clearly are more interested in that. Not to say your life is great. I actually went to your Instagram thing, so I just want to see something about who she is. Maybe I'll find it there. And then, of course, because I saw the traction that you have comparatively on Twitter, I'm like, this is where all the action is. So.
Well, yes. And I also started Twitter many, many years ago. I think I started on Twitter in 2011. And this is really, I've had an Instagram for a few years, but if you look at my number of posts, I think I've maybe posted 100 things. So I don't really use it. Like, Twitter is what I've been using and building all these years. And I think that's another thing too, where it's like, I think it's impossible to be on every social media and do it well. So I just kind of picked one and did it well. And so I do have that Twitter following. And then for Instagram, that's kind of like my happy place. It's pictures and it's not that serious. So that's why I kind of in my head, I split up the two. But I think if I were to spend a ton of time on social media, it would take away from my show. And the show wouldn't be as valuable because I'm on social media all the time. So I'm also learning as I go that I can't do everything. So I have to pick and choose. And that's hard too.
Words of wisdom. Thanks for sharing that, Jen. And thanks for sharing your time this afternoon, evening, whatever time it is where you are. And please extend my gratitude to your husband for giving you the space to do so tonight in your hotel.
I will. He'll appreciate that.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thanks again for having me.
The pleasure was mine, Jennifer Briney. That was a fun conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, you should check out her podcast, Congressional Dish. You can find out about the podcast and Jen at congressionaldish.com. If you'd like to keep up with my weird world and some of the insightful and useful things I'm learning from guests or otherwise discovering on my own, head over to morningtempo.com to sign up for my monthly Muse letter. Yes, Muse, M-U-S-E. It's a great way to support the podcast. It's free and you can unsubscribe at any time. This podcast exists in part through, no, not in part, entirely through the generosity of its listeners. If you found value in this episode, please follow us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps others discover it. And to learn about the variety of ways you can support the podcast, please visit morningtempo.com/crowd sponsor. Thanks again for listening. That is a wrap. I am peacing out. Enjoy your day. be kind to others, stay creative, and stay curious.